Welcome to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. On this podcast, we journey through the devastating experience of the death of a child. Grief is seldom discussed openly in our culture, and the death of a child makes people feel even more uncomfortable. We approach the topic openly and honestly, speaking to people who have lost loved ones and experts who help care for them. Whether you are a parent experiencing loss or someone who wants to support another going through this tragedy, this podcast strives to offer hope and help.
Thank you so much, Cassie, for agreeing to come on the Always Andy's Mom podcast. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thank you, Marcy. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me and all these other people out there that are in our situation.
Well, I was mentioning to you earlier before we started recording that when I look at my statistics, I can see where people are, where they're listening from all around the world. And I've had this very faithful listener in Paris, France for a long time. And for an extremely long time, I had no idea who that faithful listener was. But it turns out it is you.
Yeah.
So it was a beautiful thing to get that first email from you. And I thought, oh, that's who it is. I mean, I occasionally have more than one, but there's always one that's just really quite faithful. And now I know who that is. So that's nice. And now I would love for you to talk about your daughter, Ella, and just to let us get to know her a little bit.
Okay. Ella is, well, first of all, I'm American. My husband's French, but I've been living in France for 31 years now. So actually more than half my life. We have 4 kids. Ella was our second child. So we had 2 daughters, 2 sons. And Ella was born in 1996 and it's funny when you look back, now that I have quite a number of years of examining what it's like to have children and watch them grow up. Ella was just a magnificently healthy baby in every way. But there were things, I don't want to sound too woo-woo, but there were little signs, I feel like, from the very beginning. The first one being that something was going to happen. The first one being that when I was 7 months pregnant with her, my doctor says, I'm a little concerned about the spacing between her eyes. I want to do an amniocentesis. You can imagine the panic that goes on when you're a mother and they want to do an amnio. And that would have been in the month of August when all of France is closed down because everybody goes on vacation. And so we went ahead and did it because we just, you don't know what to do. I couldn't even think about it, what it meant one way or the other, or what implications. The whole thing was just overwhelming, but I was just following the doctor's orders.
Well, and you would have worried for 2 months. Awful. Incessantly, right? I mean, there was once you put it out there, it would have been difficult, I think.
It was very difficult. It took 2 weeks to get the results. So after 2 weeks, we knew that there was nothing. Or we thought there was nothing. We'll think differently now after knowing what's happened. But yeah, so that was the way Ella started her life. And then she was born, and she couldn't have been healthier. And she was this really sort of voracious, interested, smart kid that wanted to do everything. She was very intense. She was always a bit different in the sense that she marched to her own drumbeat, shall we say, and she was never really influenced by what everybody around her was doing in a very good and healthy way.
Yeah.
And she was really smart. Everybody's kid is really smart, but we always found her particularly smart. She was the kid in France. When you're little, they do this very lovely thing in schools. They have you draw a little man starting when you're very little. And in France, you can start school at about 2.5. And Ella started school. She would only go in the mornings, 2.5. And she was the kid that when everybody else was drawing the arms coming out of the head, she would draw a full body and she would understand the way the body, was structured. And that was maybe an indication of what we would come to know as an extraordinarily creative and artistic personality and talent. She was original in everything. She was original in the way she dressed. She was original in the way she did her hair. She was original in the way that she thought about things. And she was, I don't know, she would write you a letter, and the letter wouldn't just be a letter that had either been handwritten or typed. It would be a letter that there would be drawings all over it, and there would be all these clever things left, right, and center. And then she would make the envelope herself. And so she went on, and she had an extremely easy time at school. She took great pleasure in that because everything was so easy. She never really had to work very hard at school. But she was never one of these competitive kids. She would always put the bar incredibly high for herself, but it was herself against herself. She would love to share her knowledge with other people and talk about things. And so she ended up being a true intellectual as well, in the sense that she was interested in movies. She really knew about movies, and she could tell you about the movies. She could tell you about the directors. She could tell you about, things that other kids were just enjoying the movie, but Ella was like really into it. She wasn't always easy. She was very stubborn. She had her way of doing things. She had her aesthetic was, it's impossible to describe. Everybody that knew her knew that Ella had a special aesthetic, and everybody, well, I can't say everybody, but many, many people really respected her take on things. They might not have wanted to dress that way themselves, but it was always interesting. And she was known to be one of these kids, and that's a feedback that we got from a number of her friends after she died, is that she was the one that made it okay to be yourself and inspired kids, her friends, to try to figure out who they were, and that it was okay. They didn't need to conform and be like everybody else. And so she was
amazing.
She was a very special person.
It's funny that you say that, because I do tell parents this all the time that come in and are kind of upset that their kid is, stubborn and strong-willed and all of this. And I'll say, this is going to do them so well when they're older, because the other kids won't push them around, and they will find their own way and find their own path. And can be hard to parent those kids sometimes, but it's amazing to see them as adults, I think.
It can make their lives more difficult too, I think. Because if there's a rule book that you embrace and you follow, you'd ask yourself fewer questions. Ella was always asking herself questions, and she overthought things. But when she would overthink things and she would share her thoughts, they always sort of made sense. She taught me so much from all different angles, be it, just about, say, I don't want to say just movies, because she had many different artists, for example. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of artists and their works, and, their exhibit with her. And, I think it's frozen again. It's frozen. You know?
I can hear you, though. You froze for a second. I can't hear you very loudly, but start talking again.
Okay, now I'm back.
Okay, now you're good. Now you're good.
My
See,
very
the editor will fix it. It's fine.
Yeah, my very bad internet connection. What was I saying? Talking about
the artists.
Yeah, artists. And you go to an exhibit with her, and we went to lots of exhibits with the kids when they were little, and we'd go through the exhibit. And then we'd like, Ella, we're going to meet you at the cafe down the street, because Ella would need more time because she really looked at everything. But she was also, she knew a huge amount about pop culture. I mean, I can remember when she was younger, it must have been around 10 or 8, 9, 10, 11, something like that. She had this extraordinary fascination with Hilary Duff. I don't know if you remember.
I do.
He knew everything about Hillary Duff. and, and so it could be, I mean, up until when she died, she would teach me about popular culture too. So she had a really vast array of interests, and she could always, when she would have an idea about something and you said, I don't quite agree, she would more often than not sort of talk you through it, and then you'd sort of see why she might have been right. But I don't want to paint her as perfect, because she wasn't. She could be difficult, and life became more difficult for her as she got older, because she sailed through high school, but by sort of the end of high school, she decided she didn't really want to study certain things that didn't interest her. And all of my kids, as I said, they're half French. They were always in a French school, and then when they got older, we put them in a bilingual school. And she ended up doing the International Baccalaureate, which I know exists in many schools as well in the US. And she had to study physics. And she wasn't remotely interested in physics, even though, strangely enough, I'm jumping back and forth in time, but I feel like that happens in a situation, like it all becomes same time. It doesn't matter if it was 20 years ago or 3 years ago. Well, she was the kid when she was little. I can remember my husband asking a bunch of little kids, so what's the biggest number in the world? And the kids would be like, well, it's 3 gazillion, bazillion, blah, 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 blah. And Ella just looked at him and said, what are you talking about? There is no bigger number. You can always add 1.
Yeah.
And so she was like, yeah, you're right, Ella. I hadn't even thought about myself. But she was very wise. She was very, very loyal, incredibly loyal person. She would think about another memory that comes to mind that was just so extraordinary. I remember she would have been 10 or 11, and she'd just changed schools from the little elementary school to go into middle school. She was still just in the French system at that point. And she had her very, very best friend, and they'd gone to the same school together. And then at that age, kids start to change, and some mature faster than others. And Ella had a crush on this boy in a class. And this friend of hers, who she thought to be her, BFF, decided to tell the class or tell some other people about this crush that was it was so mortifying to Ella. She felt completely and utterly betrayed. And it was, I remember I cried with her. The whole thing was just so sad. And then I can remember, I don't know whether it was 6 months after, something like that. I was in her bedroom giving her a kiss goodnight. And she says to me, Mom, I'm thinking about forgiving Louise. That was her friend. And then we had this whole discussion about forgiveness and what forgiveness meant. And I was like, my God, Ella, you're making me, the adult, think about what forgiveness really is. It was just, she played on many different levels, and her mind was always working. And on another level, I think that did make life more complicated for her, because she couldn't just go about her business and do her thing.
Follow the rules.
Follow the rules. Yeah. So back to the physics thing, that was the other thing. She didn't like physics. And so I can remember going with her to the physics teacher, and she hadn't done any work all year. I was like, Ella, the teacher says, Ella, do you need to pass physics in order to go on to college and to get your high school diploma? And she gives this little funny smile out of the corner of her mouth. She goes, yeah. And he was like, well, do something about it. We had 10 days before the end of the school year. And so then Ella, in the space of 10 days, learned the physics course in order to pass the physics, in order to get that part of the IB together and then to move on. She was like that. She was very strong-willed. And when she put her mind to something, she got what she needed or wanted.
Do you want to go on now and talk about what happened with her illness?
Yes. So Ella, I've forgotten a big part of her life. I just want to mention Japan was a huge part of her life.
Japan.
Yeah, but I'll come back to that actually talking. Well, she went off to college. She went off to the University of Chicago and studied here there, and decided it wasn't the right place for her. Came back to Paris, didn't know what to do, decided to go off to a place called Shikoku, which is an island with 88 temples on it. That is a pilgrimage place for Japanese people, has been for I don't know how many hundreds of years. And she went and did that pilgrimage, came back and decided, okay, I'm going to go and study Japanese and do that in London. So she went off to London and she did her course at London and at SOAS, the School of Asian and Oriental Studies, and then finished the program, although she hadn't finished all the work. And I somehow feel like this is related to what then happened. She finished in 2019. And we said, well, Ella, we're not going to support you living in London. If you're not in school, you're going to have to get a job. And so she came back to Paris and she lived at home at the end of June, beginning of July 2019, got herself a job. And she still had a few outstanding papers that she was supposed to work on. She just couldn't get them done. And it was just unimaginable to us because she had so much. She was a beautiful writer. She had so much knowledge in her head. What was going on? Why couldn't she finish these? And but she went and she worked at a bookstore and she liked it in the beginning because it was easy. She didn't have to think about what she was doing in life. And then by the end of November, she started having headaches and didn't really think that much about them because she thought, oh, I'm spending too much time on the computer. Yeah. And she had a couple of episodes of seeing double, but the seeing double was something that reminded her of a period in her life when she was 6 years old, when she was seeing double, where we thought she had a brain tumor. And I'd taken her to doctors everywhere in France and the US, and we did tests left, right, and center, and nothing showed up. So it was the same symptom. She didn't really think about it and went on with her life, and she continued working. And then Christmastime rolled around, and before that, she had a little bit of a blockage in her nose. And so we thought, okay, maybe it's probably a sinus infection. So she went to one doctor. The doctor gave her antibiotics, didn't do anything. Another doctor, antibiotics, didn't do anything. A third doctor, this is a nasty, nasty sinus infection. And we spent Christmas together, and then she went back to work. And I think it was on, if you remember the dates, the very specific dates, it was on the 4th of January. She went to work in the morning, came back in the afternoon. She said, my head hurts too much. I can't go back to work. And I was like, Ella, we got to notch it up a bit and figure out really what's going on with this sinus infection. And so we ended up finding a doctor. She ended up finding a doctor in the middle of the night online. Now in France, finding a doctor on a Saturday, because that was a Friday, finding a doctor on a Saturday is almost an impossible feat, but she managed to do it. We went to the doctor. He looks at her and says, ooh, really bad. We need to do a little scan maybe to make sure this isn't going to go into meningitis. And from that day on, it went, I was like, meningitis, somehow some bigger power was helping us to get a scan that day on Saturday.
Yes, right.
Got the scan. And the doctor reading the scan said, this is the nastiest sinus infection. But we had another appointment already scheduled for the Monday. Another ORL went to him and he said, this might be the tip of an iceberg, and got us into immediately, like the next day, to see a sinus expert who said, I'm going to have to biopsy this. And we didn't know what was going on. All we knew is that Ella had a really nasty sinus infection. We did the biopsy, and then we got the results 10 days later. From that moment on, it was one emergency after the other. It was a extremely rare, off the charts rare tumor. I'll give you the official name: SMARCB1 SMARCB1 deficient sinonasal carcinoma, which has SMARCB1 being the one and only gene that was mutated in it, which happens also to be pretty much the one and only gene mutated in rhabdoid tumors, which you probably have heard about, which in itself is very, very rare pediatric tumors. Hers happened to be in her sinus, and by the time it was diagnosed, and they were very quick in the diagnosis. Actually, the pain went from being bad to absolutely intolerable. She was on morphine starting by the end of January in pill form, and then intravenously by the beginning of February. Started the chemo immediately, which of course didn't do anything. In fact, the chemo there's sort of a suspicion now that maybe the chemo, the tumor cells were able to get around the chemo and become even more aggressive. Radiation had absolutely no effect at all. There was one experimental drug that we threw through connections we have in New York, because she was treated here in Paris, but we also had people at Sloan Kettering in New York weighing in and following the treatment and agreeing on everything. We were able to get that medication for her, but she was too sick to take it. She was gone in 3.5 months.
Wow.
So it was sort of, and I think about this, often we parents that have lost children, is it worse an accident or a illness or whatever? And one of my other kids had said to me, it's a little bit like Ella was at the crossroads of the two. It was an accident and an illness at the same time. It all went so fast. And it was just one emergency after another, after another, after another. And she died on
just blink. Mm-hmm.
She died on the 24th of April, 2020, which means that this was all happening at the beginning of COVID.
Yeah.
Which for us in our situation was like a blip on the screen, because Ella was what we were so focused on, obviously. But in one way, it was positive for us in the treatment, because to get her to the hospital back and forth, there was no traffic. There was nobody in the hospital aside from the patients and the doctors. And, but it was a nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly was. It certainly was. It's hard to wrap your head around it when it happens so quickly like that too, I think. You're absolutely right that it's really almost a combination of the people that have to watch this low suffering that I've, spoken to quite a few of those, and then those of us who just in an instant. Mm-hmm.
It's all over. And it never occurred to me. I mean, I knew, because I read and investigate things myself. And I knew back in January that this was terminal. I only knew that I knew that in retrospect when I have a therapist that I had seen in the past, that I'd gone and seen at the very beginning when Ella was first diagnosed. And she was the one that reminded me that on the 20th of January, I knew this was terminal. But when Ella was sick, I completely and utterly put that was not even an issue. My daughter was not dying. It wasn't possible. And it becomes, it's just not possible. And it was not possible after she died that she actually died. And I still very often, this is just not possible what's happened.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just hard to wrap
I think we all feel that way. No, it's just how could this be? It makes no sense.
Mm-hmm. So were they forthright with you, the treating team, about the fact that it was terminal, or did they avoid it? I'm just kind of curious.
They avoided it.
Yeah.
The thing about the cancer that she had is that it's not, a lot of oncologists have never heard of it. They've never heard of this particular mutation. But she was initially hospitalized in an adult ward because she was 23. And after the first chemo, we finished the first chemo session. They came and met with us with people from pediatrics, because they had understood that this was more like a rhabdoid tumor than a regular head and neck tumor. And so they put us in pediatrics, which was, given the COVID context, a huge gift to us, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to be with her, which I was able to be with her. My husband, no, only one of us was allowed to go in, but I was able to be with her 24/7 when she was hospitalized.
Right. And that wouldn't have happened had she been
that would not have happened. I mean, I can't even go there in my head thinking about, my God, if she were facing that on her own. But they never did. And the only time that Ella knew is the bottom line. She knew. We never talked about it with her because A, it was unimaginable, and B, it was unimaginable, and I knew nothing about death. I mean, honestly, I'm one of these blessed people that up until the age of 55, I'd never experienced anything like this, any kind of real loss of anybody. And the last time we went into the hospital was the only time that it was really addressed. And Ella, it was extraordinary because she knew what was going on. She had the night before she went into the hospital for the last time. And I just want to take a little parenthesis and talk about how she was so dignified throughout. I think dignified would be the word. Calm, dignified. She'd said to us at one point, I don't know if I want to live if I'm going to go blind, which she did go blind because when it was diagnosed, it was already in her meninges and it took away her vision on her left side and then started taking away
your sinuses are all so close to the eyes.
So awful. It's just, and the pain was controlled because she was on such extraordinarily heavy pain medication, which didn't, and that was an interesting thing. God, I've learned so much, but when you have such pain and you're taking these medications, the medication just goes to the pain. It didn't affect her personality. It was just controlling the pain. She never, on the scale of 1 to 10, said she hurt more than a 3. I mean, it was, I mean, that, and I don't think she was saying that to make us feel better. I think it was really very, very well controlled. But the night before she went into the hospital for the last time, which we thought we were going in to decide whether or not to continue the chemo, because she was still coming and joining us for dinner at that point. She couldn't eat anything because every time she would move, she would throw up because of the pressure. And, but she would come down to the table. She would dress and come down to the table. She was extraordinary. Ella, as I said, her whole relationship to clothes and to all that it was unlike other people. Like she would dress to go to her radiation sessions before that, and not just your average outfit. I mean, she spent every penny she'd saved during the time she was working, and she bought herself these wild hats, and this one was big one with feathers on it, these big black feathers. And we have these photographs of her. It's the last time she came to dinner before going into the hospital. But that night, so we all had dinner together. I went to bed. My eldest daughter, Zoe, went up with her to the bedroom and they sat there and she played for Zoe a Nina Simone song, which is, I wish I knew how it would be to be free, which in retrospect, we understood was her telling us that she was ready to dying. But it's a song that gives a tremendous amount of hope. I'm going to send you the lyrics to it because it's just so absolutely beautiful. But then she went in the next day into the hospital. We went in, we met with the doctor. She was starting to have all sorts of other neurological problems, like numbness in her chin and her hand. And our doctor didn't say anything. They thought, and she had a little hard gland-like thing on her neck. And we go into the hospital and I said to the doctor, we absolutely must biopsy that. I mean, I was still, very much in, what we're taking care of this, we're going to make her better. And he was like, oh, I don't know. When I push and I push and I push, next thing I knew, we did that little biopsy. They brought her down for the biopsy. And because it was COVID, I wasn't in the room where they did the biopsy, but I was where you couldn't usually be in normal times because there was nobody else in the hospital. And the doctor comes out and says, well, we did a scan of her lungs and we're not quite sure. We're not quite sure what it is. I was like, oh, he said, well, it might be COVID. So then they put us in a COVID room, which meant that I wasn't able to leave the room. She obviously wasn't able to leave the room. No chance of my husband seeing her, where she went from extremely bad to dying in the space of, we went in on a Thursday and she died 8 days later.
Wow.
And the only time that what was happening was ever talked about was she'd said to the doctors, it would have been on the Tuesday before she died. She says, well, what are the next steps? And the doctor, who was not her main doctor, but the doctor that was on duty, and I will be forever grateful to this woman, she said, well, Ella, we've done everything we can.
Yeah.
And now you need to look inward.
Yeah.
I don't remember how she said it exactly, but it was very beautiful. And Ella understood.
Yeah.
I didn't even understand. I think she understood. And at that point, they let my husband and our other kids into the hospital.
Yeah.
So we were all with her when she died.
That's a blessing, at least, to have gotten that.
It was a blessing. I tell you, she gave so many. So the last night, the second to last night, my husband was allowed to stay with Ella and me in the room. And then the Thursday night, the night before she died, Zoe, my eldest, she and I both felt that Ella wanted a girls' night. And so Zoe stayed in the hospital in the room with us. And Ella was not talking at that point. And I remember stepping out of the room, all of it sort of a blur, but stepping out of the room and asking the nurses, well, so how am I going to know when something's happening? What's so strange is that it still wasn't possible when my daughter was dying, but I was living it on two levels. So I go out and I talked with the nurses and they explained to me, well, her breathing will start changing. And I was like, oh, okay. And I go back into the room. And sure enough, at 6 a.m, her breathing started to change. I call my husband and I said, I think you need to come now. And he woke up the boys and they were there 45 minutes later. But in the interim, Ella, who had, she had gone blind, but was extremely photosensitive at the same time. And so at that point, she wasn't moving, but her eyes had been closed for 2 days, but she'd been wearing sunglasses for, those 6 weeks before that. Between the time I called my husband and they arrived, I was next to her on the bed looking at her. She literally hadn't moved for 48 hours. She opened her eyes enormously like this. And she looked at me. She looked through me. It was the most extraordinary thing I've ever experienced. It's actually changed that part of what's changed my whole approach, vision, understanding as much as we can to our existence and our it was incredible.
It reminds me very much of when my own mother died. I see so many parallels between you being with her and me being with my mother, and that fact of not really being told and things like that. I mean, I think back, I was 19 years old and the nurses took me out, and I've shared this before on the podcast, but long ago, so many probably haven't heard it, but I went out of the room because they called me out and they said, you shouldn't be here by yourself because your mom could die at any time. And I didn't know. And she didn't know. And I recently was talking to medical professionals about kind of how to talk with grieving families. And I said that the thing is that I was shocked that my mother was dying and the nurses were shocked that I didn't know.
Mm-hmm. And this disconnect was just extraordinary.
It was just extraordinary, right? They had no idea that I didn't know that she was dying. And then I walked back in and my mom looked at me and she said, I'm dying, aren't I? And I said, yes, you are. And I thought at that moment, because, I was in the midst of applying to medical school and things like that. And I thought, man, those people screwed up. They didn't know what they were doing. They clearly had been taught this at one time and they all forgot. And I thought, I'm never going to let this happen. I am going to be so comfortable talking about death. Because it's totally wrong to have a 19-year-old girl have to tell her mother that she's dying, right? That is wrong. And everyone can say that is wrong.
Yeah.
But I have to say, as I went on in my medical training, I realized it's not that they forgot. It's that they were never taught. No one ever taught them what to do and how to do it. And it's just somehow supposed to magically happen that they can feel comfortable talking about this. And that's why it's my new mission now is to feel like I need to educate medical professionals so they're not so scared of it. And so they can talk to people. And so then the experiences you have and the experiences I have are not the same. Right. And I don't think about that. The fact that you should have known
Mhm.
more earlier than you did, for sure. Mm-hmm.
I've,
And
I've
I even
often,
think, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, just saying, I often think about these doctors wandering around the halls of the hospital,
Uh-huh.
thinking, do you realize that these patients lying in bed, that could be you? It's like
Yeah.
it's a strange, I mean, maybe it's a way you survive as well as a doctor, but
Yeah.
they don't have any power. But,
No.
you know, these things happen to all of us. And I have no tolerance for people not being able. I have sort of taken it upon myself to educate the layperson. I'm not a medical professional,
Mm-hmm.
but I talk about it. I talk about it a lot.
Well, I think back to that time. So my mom was being taken care of by a cardiology team at that point in time because the chemotherapy had actually caused her to go into heart failure. So, I mean, she was dying from cancer, but what ultimately kills her was the heart failure from the chemotherapy. So she had a cardiology team who really she did not know well. And I remember very vividly a conversation with them saying, well, Mrs. Peterson, you'd be a perfect candidate for a heart transplant, except that you have metastatic cancer. And so you can't get a heart transplant if you have cancer. And I think now, in hindsight, they thought they told us she was dying by saying that statement. Like, you need a new heart. We can't give you a new heart. Thus, you are dying. But they never said, thus, you are dying. They never ended that. They just assumed that we would realize that if she can't get a heart transplant, that means she's going to die. But in our minds, it was like, okay, yeah, she really would need a new heart to get back to normal, but there are these medications and they'll make her heart stronger and she'll certainly be out by Christmas. And I mean, never in my mind did I think, well, that means this is the end. And I think they thought they told us. I'm pretty sure they would have thought that, right? It's just that disconnect and not really understanding each other and knowing what's happening.
But there's also that element of, a doctor's job is to keep people alive. So when somebody dies on some level, it's a failure. And
right.
Even though
but yet everyone dies. And
Everyone
does that mean
dies,
that somebody screwed up every single time somebody dies? No, absolutely. It does not mean that. But everyone does die.
It's as human as being born, and we can't be here to die if we're not born. And it's, there's a doctor. I've read so many different things, and I'm going to put together a bibliography. At some point, it might be useful to somebody who approaches, these horrible situations the same way. But for me, it was essential to read everything, watch everything, listen to every podcast, anything I could get my hands on. And there's one doctor that I just find extraordinary, named Dr. Christopher Kerr, who is the head of some huge hospice center in Buffalo, New York. Okay. And he tells a story, and I might have heard it when I was hearing him. He's done a number of different things. By the way, he's done some very interesting studies on end-of-life experiences, but we don't have time to talk about everything. But he talks about when he first arrived as an intern it must have been in a palliative care place, that some patient came in. It was somebody who had AIDS, who was quite ill, and was put in the room. And he says to the nurse, do X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. And the nurse looked at him and said, that man's dying. And he said, no, give him X, Y, and Z. She said, no, he's dying. He's having these deathbed visions and all sorts of different things. She said, I think you missed that class in school. And that changed this fellow's entire career. And I do think it's also just too hard for so many people to talk about. And therefore they avoid it. Yeah. And it's easy for them to say they assume that, we, the family, understood, but no, we don't understand, because it's not possible that somebody you love so much will no longer be there. It just,
it is. It's just impossible to accept. And it's funny that there are days, for me, even now 3.5 years later, there are days when I still feel like this can't be my life. Yeah. This can't be what's happened to me. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Right.
No, it doesn't make any sense. No.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about your grief journey and the fact that this all started with COVID. how that kind of impacted it, because I would think that would have had a major impact. I mean, were you able to do like funeral thing this like you normally would have been able to, or anything like that?
Well, what we did is we were allowed 20 people, family included, Ella included, at the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, where she's buried. So about 10 days after she died, we did a ceremony there with my husband's brother, who lives in Paris, and his children, and a few of our friends. We have two very close sets of friends who also had lost children for very different reasons. But yeah, I have an extreme. I have two extremely close girlfriends who have one a friend from childhood who lives in the U.S. and another friend that I've met here as an adult in Paris, who have both lost daughters. But there are two groups of friends, couples that in Paris came as well. So we did a little something there. And then I don't know what the next 6 months, year were. I mean, it's all a blur. I just feel I was somehow held up by my kids, my husband, by a few friends. I really don't know. What we always felt very strongly about is that we needed to do a proper celebration of Ella.
Yeah.
We initially, and that was my husband, because he's, as I think some, won't say all, but a lot of men they deal with things through action. He, with a friend of his, reproduced one of Ella's works, an extraordinary little book that unfolds like an accordion.
Okay.
And reproduced that, and we sent that out to everybody as a little gift from Ella. And then we just exactly a month ago, on the 24th of April, 2022, did the celebration of Ella's life. I dreaded it with every bone 2 years after, because it was always, because we have friends put a little all over, and I family, and I
and travel would have been impossible for a long time.
Absolutely impossible. And so we did that a month ago, and it was very beautiful from what I can remember. I was, it was, I was so scared to go through it again. It's not like I don't live with this pain all day long, every single day, but the idea of the ceremony, but it was so clearly the right thing to do, to give her friends a place to come to young people today. I mean, so many have no place to express, to share their emotions, and so that's what we did. And I had my family come over. My brother managed to get COVID, and so he got to stay an extra week. He couldn't go back to the States, but but his wife and children and my mother were able to go back. My father actually died at the end of January of this year, and so we've, as a family, have been dealing with a lot of loss in a very short period of time. But I want to just say another thing, which is how everything can be so, life is so strange. My father was quite ill, and he had a couple of crises where he was in the hospital for like a couple of weeks. And for me, it was, the first one would have been in March of 2021. So less than a year after Ella died. And I flew over to the States. I'd actually already had COVID myself at that point, so I wasn't at all worried about giving it to anybody. I literally had it, several weeks before. And so I was the person in the hospital. I was his advocate. It was very, very important to me I'd spent so much time in the hospital. It was sort of what I knew how to do, and I could help him. And we had some just extraordinary conversations. And then the same thing happened. He went back into the hospital back in December of last year. And one of the conversations we had, he was really dying at that point. He said, and my father was a very rational, he was a lawyer and very rational. He said at one point, and my mother was there, so I wasn't just myself making it up. He said, I've had 3 nights in a row. It's just been so hard in my head. I've been going to this place. I don't know where it is, but it's It's not this world. It's not another world. You really have to know the guy to understand how strange it is that he would speak this. He said it was somewhere in between, and it was so, so hard. And I had the presence of mind because of all the reading and investigating I've done to ask him questions like, Dad, was there anyone there that you knew? And long pause. I said, well, there are people from the hospital. I didn't want to lead him into anything. It was like a long pause. And he finally said, Ella was there.
Oh.
I said, Dad, well, he said, she was there. She wasn't my granddaughter, and I wasn't her grandfather. She was there. And I was like, what Dad, was she? I mean, I was anything. I was just drinking his every word. I was like, was she happy? Was she safe? And he said, yeah, she was just doing her thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the biggest gift I ever could have received.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was.
That is a gift.
And I feel like that's a gift for everybody.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to keep that one to myself, because this is, it could have been anybody. Maybe he was seeing maybe he was seeing Andy. I mean, you know.
Well, I think too, when you shared that Ella, who'd had her eyes closed and not been awake at all, when she opened her eyes and looked past you, that reminds me of when my mother died, minutes before she died. Actually, she hadn't known me for 2 days. She hadn't been able to say my name. She sort of knew her parents a little bit, but hadn't said anything to me. And we were getting her up because she said she kind of had to go to the bathroom. So we're trying to get her up, and she looked up. I still remember she looked up off to the right into like the corner of the room, but she wasn't looking at that. And she just got this wide-eyed look on her face of just awe. And she just said, oh, Marcy.
Oh.
And I could tell she was seeing the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen in her life. And I got the gift of her last word out of her mouth was my name.
Oh, so beautiful.
Because then she started that kind of agonal breathing, the end breathing, and she died. But the last thing was that look off into her seeing something amazing and just wanting to tell it to me, even though she hadn't known who I was for 2 days.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, and it was such a blessing to me. I feel like it was meant for me to be the one to see that, because of Andy dying so many years later. I mean, obviously, I was in college. I hadn't met my husband. There was no thought of children. There was no thought of anything. But for me then to lose my Andy and to think of him seeing that beauty with his grandma, who he never met, is just really powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I feel like that's what Ella was looking at too, don't you think?
It was truly extraordinary. And I, being a very rational person too, I looked into whatever they call that adrenaline rush that people sometimes have before they die. My daughter was not having an adrenaline rush. It was something so much bigger than that. And it was incredible.
And it is a gift. There's no question. It's a gift. It's something I will keep with me forever and ever. Yeah. And it gives me a little bit of comfort even now. And also, thinking of them together, just as I'm sure you think of Ella and your dad together in that way as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to talk a little bit about, you did this just a month ago. I wonder, I think to myself that some things that can hold up your grieving process a little bit. And one for me certainly was the court stuff. And until the court stuff was done, I felt like I couldn't really start to grieve. So it took me almost that year before I felt like I could start. Do you feel like having this now celebration of Ella has given you something that you've been kind of waiting for and lacking? You think? Well, I mean, it might be too early to tell in some ways.
Yeah. I don't, one thing that it's not answering that question at all. One thing that I do find very peculiar is that I feel like Ella died truly yesterday. I mean, it was really yesterday. I feel like the celebration of her life could have been a long time ago. What seems so recent is Ella's dying.
Yeah.
I do think it's well, with my husband, we've set up an association, and we're dedicating a lot of time, a lot of thought, and a lot of personal resources as well into something that we had been working on before the celebration. I do feel like now I can really focus more on that. So I think it has, but I think on the level, I think I so dreaded and was so pleased that COVID kept us from doing that celebration, because I so feared that would be like, that's really acknowledging what happened.
Yeah.
In a way that I
see that.
I couldn't even begin to, but it was so, having all those people there and all these people that traveled for so far away, some came for, 2 nights from across the ocean to be there. It was just, it was so, it gave me the opportunity to do what what was most important to me. I didn't think I'd be able to speak, and I did speak. And what I wanted to convey was how, among all the many, many, many gifts that Ella has given us and me and all of us, is she's truly given me the gift of understanding how connected we all are, and how we hold one another up when we don't think we can go any farther. We have this net, and this net extends not just on this physical earth. It's a lot bigger than that for me. Mm-hmm. It crosses time zones, it crosses worlds, the other world, the before world, whatever. And it was so beautiful. And then to have all of these people there, and to be able to thank them, and to and what struck me is Ella would write a lot as well, and she'd written this one piece on beauty, because beauty was something that she thought a lot about, and the meaning of beauty. And this experience encapsulated that for me. And I actually wrote it down because I want to get her words right.
Yeah.
It was just the last sentence. It was a very personal piece she'd written, but the last sentence was, "The only thing that means anything at all is excruciating beauty, if only you can find it." And that was excruciatingly beautiful.
Yeah.
That experience. And it was like, my God, Ella,
that,
like, she doesn't.
Wow, I love that phrase.
Teaching me. She never. And it was, So, it gives me, I mean, what the foundation that we've the first goal of our foundation, what we, our initial reaction was, we need to fund researchers, people that are doing things, trying to understand this horrible one mutation. I won't even go into the details because I get all tangled up when I try to talk about it, but it's a mutation it's a tumor suppressor gene that mutated, called SMARCB1. And it was first discovered 25 years ago by a researcher here in France. And there are a few people that work on it. The problem is there are very, very few known cases of tumors that are driven by this particular mutation, although this mutation does show up in a lot of cancers, but down the road, in like 20% of all cancers down the road. Anyway, so we started out thinking we're going to find a researcher and we're going to, help them with their work. And then the more people we spoke with, and we spoke with a lot of people here in the US, we came to understand that actually what would be more impactful as a first effort would be to host with the major researchers here in France a conference for the people that work on this mutation and the genetic part of the genetic complex that it's part of. And so we're in the process of setting that up. What's going to happen in May 2023. We've had overwhelmingly positive response from like super duper researchers. First initially we were like, well, are they going to go for it? And then, these rock stars from Dana-Farber and St. Jude and Sloan Kettering and MD Anderson. I mean, they're all the ones that are into this are like really into it and really into being able to spend time. They know about one another's work, but to be able to spend time together trying to figure out, what do we do? We've known about this for 25 years. It was first discovered in the context of these pediatric rhabdoid tumors, but we've made no progress.
Yeah.
And how do we move the needle forward? And so that's something that I do every day with Ella, because it requires, it's a big thing we've bitten off, and we don't know what we're doing because we're just like regular old people, but we're learning every day, and we're very dedicated to it. And
it is a beautiful thing that you can do with Ella. And it is very true that, a lot of times people are maybe duplicating efforts, or they're working on something and someone else has already kind of figured that part out. And if you can communicate, that is really, really helpful, just to be able to kind of understand. And then, you can have a new starting point in some ways, right?
Yeah. And to get people on the same page. I mean, it's complicated because I know, people don't necessarily like to share their research and this and that, but we're trying to, that's why we want to do it in the form of a conference, get them all together in this hotel, great place in the south of France, and feed people nicely and have it pleasant, and, moments that aren't work where they can actually create real connections on a human level as well. So we'll see where that goes.
That's just beautiful. I love that. I love that. Well, and I love that you can do it with her.
Yeah, she's so much.
That's just what you need, right? You need to find a little bit of purpose for your grief and something you can do with your child. I know that's what the podcast does for me. And, it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Making something positive out of something that is just so horrible.
Yeah.
So horrible, but something that can maybe one day help
somebody,
make other people not have to suffer this, so to make it not all in vain. And
maybe, never know. Maybe someday, a little bit down the road, someone will come up with some sort of new cure and treatment, and they'll say, you know what? It was that conference that I went to back in 2023 in the south of France that did it all. So thank you so much, Cassie, for sharing Ella with us and your story. And I just find it wonderful and amazing.
And thank you to you. And I also want to thank all the other mothers that have come and talked about their children, because I'm sure we all feel this way. It's truly a lifesaver.
Yeah.
It's what you've done is just amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcy.
Thanks for listening to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. We are always looking for new show ideas. If you'd like to be a guest, know someone who'd be a great guest, or have a show idea, please email us at marcy@andysmom.com. Be sure to visit the webpage, andysmom.com, for more content, including Marcy's blog. There you can also sign up to receive updates via email. Together, let's work to inspire hope, one day at a time.